Good evening, Chicago. Tonight, we come together, united by the transformative power of stories. Stories that cross divides, inspire new perspectives, and unite us all. For over 2 decades, One Book, One Chicago has been a beacon of connection for our city. It brings us together, neighborhood by neighborhood, sharing a story that fuels conversations, enriches understanding, and strengthens our city. This year's selection, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, captures this spirit. Recognized as one of the New York Times 100 best books of the 21st century, woo-woo. It's also a favorite among our library cardholders, reaching readers across Chicago with its themes of resilience, creativity, and friendship. The story of Sam and Sadie, two friends building worlds together through gaming, reminds us of the worlds that we build together. And like them, we're stronger and more vibrant when united. At the Chicago Public Library, we create spaces that welcome every voice, every story, every Chicagoan. This year alone, we welcome thousands who have joined us for silent readings, hands-on workshops, and meaningful discussions, making this book and its theme a part of our shared Chicago experience. A heartfelt thank you to the partners who make this possible, the Art Institute, the American Writers Museum, and community leaders like Alderwoman Sam Nugent and Sylvia Ewing. To our incredible library family, our dedicated staff across 81 library locations, our adult services, marketing, and our library foundation, including supporters, Bank of America and United, your commitment makes One Book, One Chicago possible. So as we celebrate tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, let's continue to honor the power of stories to connect us, to reveal our shared humanity, and to build a Chicago where everyone feels at home. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Julie Chavez, Senior Vice President of Local Markets at Bank of America, one of our steadfast partners in making One Book, One Chicago a reality. Please welcome Julie Chavez.
Wow, this is awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, and everyone. I'm one of 5,300 people, so I have a couple people from Bank of America here, so thank you, Priya Sanarangani, who is on the board of Chicago Public Library Foundation, and my colleague, Steve Adamczyk. So again, it's an honor for us to be a sponsor of One Book, One Chicago again. And our connection to the Chicago Public Library goes back many, many years, and I probably remember all of them. So we have supported many One Book, One Chicago programs, certainly a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of shared appreciation for what reading is and the impact that reading can have and books can have on our lives. I have a deep connection with the Chicago Public Libraries and remember, maybe some of you, that the original Chicago Public Library was headquartered at the Chicago Cultural Center. I go way back. So as a kid in school, I remember spending my days, my evenings, and weekends going to the Chicago Cultural Center. That was the library, and it's a beautiful place. But then Harold Washington Library came to be, and so glad because we have this wonderful space to enjoy, and it really is more inclusive. And obviously, the Chicago Cultural Center is still a beacon, an icon. But the Harold Washington Library is one of many libraries, and glad that it was built. So as you know, this year's One Book, One Chicago, as Chris said, is against a backdrop of gaming, and it appeals to a much younger demographic. But here's a secret. You're never too old to learn. So it is about the timeless and ageless concepts that Chris said about friendship, creativity, connection, and ambition, those never go away. And no matter how old you are, we all feel and think that. And so, and also speaking of youth, certainly the library's dedication of resources to youth certainly is a mutual goal for both our organizations. Libraries programs provide awareness and access to thousands of Chicago public school students and educators, from homework help with Teacher in the Library, STEM learning programs, college and career events for teens. So we know that reading and education opens doors and to career opportunities and so much more. So thank you, Chicago Public Library Foundation and Chicago Public Library staff and board members, friends, and we look forward to hearing more from Gabrielle tonight. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Julie. Hi there, I'm Jennifer Lezak, and I manage the One Book, One Chicago program. So thanks. I want to thank you all for being here and helping us to celebrate the joy of reading. It is my pleasure to introduce our guests for tonight. Gabrielle Zevin is the New York Times and internationally best-selling author of Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which you all know, which won many, many awards, including Amazon's Best Book of 2022, Best Book of the Year from Indigo, Time, The Globe, Mail, New York Times, Chicago Public Library's Best of the Best, and so much more. Her other critically acclaimed novels include The Storied Life of A.J. Thickery, Young Jane Young, and Elsewhere, all also available on the shelves upstairs. Her books have been translated into over 40 languages, and I think I just heard there might be some movies coming. She lives in Los Angeles, and we're so happy she's joining us here tonight. She's going to be in conversation with friend of the library, Donna Seaman, editor of Booklist, and I'll give you a little spoiler alert. Donna also has a new book coming out, and you'll be able to see her in March speaking about her book, which is about the joy of reading. So please join me in welcoming two wonderful authors to the stage, Gabrielle Zevin and Donna Seaman.
Hello. Chicago.
Yes.
Wow.
Look at this. This is wonderful. Welcome, everyone. It's so exciting to be talking about this beautiful book. So let's begin at the beginning. I could never resist asking.
It's a good place to start
Isn't
if
it?
they give you an option. Although
Yes, I
sometimes
take
I
that
used to read books, I'd always read the last sentence of the book first. And then I became a writer and I began to hate anyone that actually would do that. But I wanted to make sure that it would be worth it for me if I read this whole book, that it was going to end somewhere that I want it to be. So I'm still conscious of that every book I write, if there is somebody out there who reads this way, I want to make sure that it seems like it's worth it to go based on that last sentence.
That's so interesting because there's so much emphasis on opening sentences.
It is.
Do people obsess about closing sentences enough?
I don't think they do,
I
but
don't
I do
either.
think a lot of novels sort of fatigue as they go, that you feel like, wow, the writer was really in it, those first 100, and I think they're, and if anything, it seems like sometimes books end with more of a sense of relief, maybe, than really all the way through. But, the way I work is I actually read every part of my book every day that I sit down to work on it. So by the time I get to the end, I'm reading 400 pages or something, and it's slow,
Wow.
But I want to be in the exact place that a reader might be when I'm writing, so. But yes, so we kind of started at the end, but I'll let you begin at the beginning.
I love that.
Yeah.
So, well, before we go back to the beginning, I really noticed the fineness of your word-by-word writing. And you have a magnificent vocabulary. I love to read a book where I have to stop and look up words, and I love words. So,
for some people, that is a complaint. I have been
Yes.
on the internet, so
No,
we
but
don't want
it's-
to know any more words.
Yes.
We know enough. Yeah.
we do want more words. We want always to be learning.
Well,
and
that's how I feel as a
Right.
writer. I feel like why wouldn't I want to master more ingredients if I were a chef? I want always to be improving grammar, to understanding more of what language can do. I think, and having more words means having more tools. I remember a long time ago I was speaking to a class, like an English class, and they were asking me, do you really use, synecdoche? Do you really use allusion? The various literary terms are taught. And I'm like, yes, it's my toolbox, So part of that toolbox is also words. Of course they are, When I was young, I remember having a Hemingway period. I think most of us have that period. And I think there's a thought in fiction sometimes that the simplest way to say something is the best way. But sometimes the simplest way to say something is just the simplest, I'm not actually putting anything negative on that, But for me, so much of this particular book was about people that were trying to communicate simple things and found very complicated ways to do it. And so I always wanted the language to reflect these characters, in that sense.
I think complicated is good. I think emotions are complicated and subtle and nuanced. Adjectives exist for a reason.
Yes.
And they're kind of beautiful. So
they
this
are.
attitude that you shouldn't use them has always perturbed me.
Well, one of my favorite interviews I did was with the dictionary. So if your book becomes really popular, eventually somebody from Merriam-Webster will call and say, talk about your word choice. It's a little program they have called Word Choices. And it was interesting to talk about it because I think about every word, and I want every word to be the best one and to find the most precise way of saying things. And sometimes you find that you learn a new word and you actually end up learning something about yourself. So, there's the part in the book that has the sort of German words in it, Torschlusspanik, for instance, which means gate shut panic, which is this feeling that you are running out of time and you might miss an opportunity. And I remember that is exactly how I felt through all of my 20s without having any sense of how to articulate that in a word. I'm like, oh, so that's what happened in my 20s. It was Torschlusspanik, And so sometimes I'll find a new word and I'll realize I'll be able to understand something about myself that I didn't before. So I don't think actually learning more and more complicated words is something that should be seen as negative, or even it's almost like finding out that you have, maybe when you have an illness and you finally receive a diagnosis, language can act like that in a way.
Yes, I've often said good books are good medicine.
Yes.
That's really true. So I'm curious about your younger self.
Yes.
Your love of books and your love of games. What was the sort of synchronicity there?
Well, we were talking about this a little. We're both I was born in Poughkeepsie, New York, though the internet tells you otherwise, I think. But
yes,
so the thing about being born in Poughkeepsie is that the only reason you live in Poughkeepsie is if you were going to Vassar or if your parents worked for IBM. And so my parents worked for IBM. And my dad is a computer programmer. He actually was kind of like the Sam character in a sense. He was somebody who was a bit of a math genius and got bored with the academic life and decided he wanted to do something else. And so he went to work at IBM as a computer programmer. And so from a young age, I had computers in my life. And I think that and it changes the way you see technology when technology is always in your life. I don't know if you experience that as well.
Yes.
And so for me, I realized that what my dad did, that really that programming was just a kind of language, and that you learned that language in the same way you might learn French or Spanish or something like that. And that in a sense that I always thought of my dad as a writer, and I realized that programming was just a way of humans trying to communicate something from one human to another. And I think you see that maybe throughout Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, that it's a more humanistic approach to technology.
Yes, indeed. So it's storytelling.
Yes.
They're both storytelling. And in your, I bet you had a lot of fun creating the games that Sadie and Sam create in Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. Is that true?
I mean, it's funny because I don't define fun,
Work.
For me,
fun is work.
For me, fun is work, So as long as people understand that that's what we mean, that it's really, it's work,
Yes.
that I felt a sense of pleasure from finding just the right game to represent something about where they were in their lives. You know, I think from the earliest time when I was conceiving of this book, I had just written a note on a sheet of notebook paper. I keep notes. They are just for me. They don't look very attractive at all. You know how you sometimes will see beautiful handwritten notes and they have like, you know, wonderful drawings. Mine look terrible. They look frenzied or something I've heard them describe. But I wrote a note that I would maybe have the story of two game designers, the games they make become their lives. And I make many notes, and they don't always become novels. And on that day, because I had to go look this up for a special edition of the book, on that day I also had a floor plan for a 3/4 bathroom that was really like, I need to figure out this bathroom, you know? And so the most important, like, how do you get that shower, sink, and toilet all in that one little space? And so really that had many measurements, and that was the thing that I was thinking about the most that day. But the idea intrigued me, and I wasn't ready to commit to it yet. When I think about an idea, I flirt with it a little bit. I look up some things about it. It's like deciding if you're going to take on a lover. You know, you'll Google some things about her, what have you. And so I looked up some things about it, and I began to realize that the fascinating things about video games was that the entire history of video games was contained within my lifetime. And so I thought what I had here was potentially two coming-of-age stories. The first would be a coming-of-age of two artists' stories, what the Germans call a Künstlerroman. And the second would be the coming-of-age of an entire industry. And I realized that through video games, you could really see, again, what it was like to be an artist and a person across the last, say, 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, the mutual evolution of the characters and the games they're working on is fascinating.
And I just thought there are so many, we're aware that tech has changed us. You know, we know that nobody knows how to get anywhere anymore without using their phone and this kind of thing. But there aren't so many visual corollaries that reflect this change that has happened to people. And yet if you look at even, say, the history of the Mario character, you know, at the beginning Mario looks, you know, like an 8-bit figure. He's just little blocks. And, you know, now he's fully 3D rendered. You can see him from all sides. He has, if anything, too much very, like, photorealistic hair, you know. More hair. I was playing Mario Party Jamboree, which has recently come out. And at one point in it, Mario and Luigi both take off their hats. And I was like, put them back on. I don't want to know about his hair in this level of detail, but you can see this kind of like progression of the way we have changed, and just looking at that character, you know, and so it fascinated me. You have games like at the beginning of video games, a game like Pong, which is literally Mondrian-like in its minimalism. It's 2 blocks, 2 dots, you know. But then if you get to 2012, you see The Last of Us, and it looks like a movie, you know, and in between all these iterations are, again, the story of people and tech, and I thought that was fascinating. And so when I was coming up with the games in the book, I was always like, what is the story that's being told about their lives at this moment? But also, what can the tech do? You know, and then I would always cheat and make Sam and Sadie a little bit more advanced than what they should have been able to make at the time.
That's so interesting. So I'm picturing you splitting your time between books and games.
That, I wouldn't say that was true at all.
Okay.
It's
what
like
is the truth?
the truth of it is, and I think I said it to you or to somebody already, but I never once played games with an ulterior motive, and I never thought that I played video games with something interesting about me in any way. There were 9 books that came out before Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. Not a single one has a reference to video games. Not a single one. I don't think there's an interview with me before 2022 where I talk about video games, or even that my dad was a computer programmer. There is an interview with me where I talk about the fact that I thought of my dad as a writer, because I did, you know, but I don't mention that the kind of writing he did was programming, you know. And so it wasn't something I thought of as interesting. If anything, I found myself turning back to video games at certain points in my life as a sort of comfort, because they were not books, you know, because once I became a professional writer, this is a whole other story. It does sort of change your relationship to novels, you know, and so what had always been something comforting to me sometimes was not as comforting as it had once been. So I played games really casually. I didn't play in the way Sam and Sadie play. I had played a lot of games, but not with any thought to what is the historical relevance of the game that I'm playing. But when I decided to write this book, I wanted to play games as if I were an elite game designer. I wanted to think about what the best things were in the field, the things that were pushing the tech forward. And so I just set about educating myself in the same way I had studied English at Harvard. I made myself a canon of video games. I, sought the opinions of many people. And very few of the things that turned out that I played naturally were really seminal, in that sense. And that was really how I approached it, that it was this, and it ended up, I felt daunted at times, that it was, I knew that it was a bigger task than I had ever taken on as a novelist before, to kind of really understand this field in that way. And I had a head start because I knew some programming, and I had a dad who was a programmer and who was involved in product launch, and my mother also worked at IBM, and so there were things I knew about computers, but kind of just approaching video games with a great deal of, I guess, seriousness and gravity, which I hadn't really seen in books before.
Oh, it's unique. And early on, so Sadie goes to MIT back when there were almost no other women there.
Yeah.
She feels
like 1 in 3 or something.
1 in 3.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. She makes these very literary games, Emily Blaster, which is
yes.
hilarious, Emily Dickinson. But right away you draw a reader into the artistic aspects of the technical side. And I assumed you did a huge amount of research for that. But it becomes very emotional. I mean, it's very tied into the friendship of Sam and Sadie. So it's very unusual to have a novel that's about a relationship that doesn't end in a marriage. It's not
Yes.
the marriage plot. It's a deep, complicated
I
friendship.
mean, except it is a secret marriage plot,
Yeah,
because
well,
they are
that's
married in their work
In
as
their work.
collaborators. I think it's a sort of exploration of the idea of the work wife, that there are people that you spend so many hours of time with in an office, say, that have these hugely significant and meaningful relationships to them, and you may even say spend less time with your actual wife or husband at home, and so I was thinking about that in a way,
Yeah.
the importance of like work relationships. I had been a big fan of Joshua Ferris's book, Then We Came to the End, which takes place in an office, and it's kind of the romance of the end of a certain kind of office culture of the 2000s, and so I have always been interested in stories that were about relationships and the depth of relationships one might have outside of a home,
It makes me think there should be a word for that, and that we don't have one.
We'll
Meet the
invent one.
Germans.
Yes, I'm sure they may.
But they're, the first game they work on together, Ichigo, is that how you say it?
Ichigo.
Ichigo.
Yeah.
Is so profoundly moving. I mean, it's this sort of classic quest tale. There's a disaster, a displacement, you have to get home. But you're also like talking about, graphic design engines and
Yes.
design boards and all that. So it's obvious you did a huge amount of research.
For me, what was more important was like to do all that research and then to forget about it, and so you do all that so it kind of just becomes a part of you, and then you don't want to display it in that sense. I wanted to know these things, and then I wanted to just tell you this story, and so there was kind of, even I remember there was a period of time where I wasn't writing, where I was just kind of thinking about all the things that I now knew, that I hadn't known before. But yes, for me, Ichigo and all of the games they make, I have a career that has had many kinds of books in it. And for me, each of the kind of games in the book reflect different things I have made myself. So Ichigo was a version of Elsewhere, which was a book I had written many years ago. And so, and it was also, I wanted the references that Sam and Sadie had to be sophisticated. I was really tired of seeing the sort of, I don't see this as a book about gamers. I see it as a book about people that make things, as about game designers particularly. And I wanted the references to be as sophisticated as I knew they were, that I think, people have an idea of a gamer as like just some guy in the basement, and that's fine, that's true, but that wasn't the person, and no judgment about that guy, and usually a guy, but, not always. But that wasn't the story I wanted to tell. I wanted to talk about, again, how ideas become art. And so really I'm talking about how, say, ideas for me become books, And in that case, thinking about Ichigo, there's obviously the visual reference that they have that is such a touchstone, which you can see at the Art Institute of Chicago, I think, for a little bit longer. I went to see it today, by the way. So they told me a great story, which is that the last time the Great Wave, Hokusai's Great Wave, was on display in Chicago was 5 years ago, 2019. And so the Great Wave can only come out every 5 years for 3 months because it's too, easily broken. It's too easily damaged, So it's great, I guess, synchronicity that One Book, One Chicago was able to come out at the same time as the Hokusai was able to emerge into the Art Institute of Chicago. It's very cool to see it there. But yes, so I was thinking about Homer and obviously like, those kinds of stories in terms of what the story of Ichigo is. Yeah.
Yes, there's such immense fluency in your novel, in literature, in creativity, in the gamers, and also a psychological fluency. I mean, there's such depth to each of your characters, and I wonder if you could talk about their sources a little bit. Marx is an amazing creation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, he's the one that's least like me. I always say the other one. And so in a sense, it doesn't hurt my feelings at all that he's everyone's favorite. It's fine.
I didn't say it was my favorite.
It's fine. I'm fine with you feeling that way. But I did give him my mother's name, and I gave not my mother's name. His mother and my mother have the same name. And I did also give him my college extracurricular, which was theater, And so he has some things that are me in him. But he's very far from me. I liked, we were talking about words before, so there's a particular word, which is cicerone, and which means somebody who's kind of this knowledgeable person who can be a guide in a city and just knows things. And so for me, that was Marx. He's a cicerone. He is somebody who can easily be, again, a guide in any city that he finds himself in, and so that was a thing that was important to me about him. But really, in terms of Mark, Sadie, and Sam, the way I thought of it was that really this was a story about how the different economic background you might come from affects the kind of art you can make, And so in a sense, it's easy to be Marx. He's rich and he's very handsome, so he goes through life very easily, but it's more difficult to be Sadie or Sam, Sadie because she is a woman, and Sam because, he is poor, and he's poor and he is disabled, and that limits some choices he can make as an artist, and those were the things I wanted to explore with those three characters, really.
Yes, everyone could use a Marx. I mean, I was
yes.
sort of, wow. Well, let's talk about Sam. That there's so many things that swirl around him, sort of immigration. His Korean parents have a pizza parlor. He has this terrible loss, this terrible tragedy that leaves him disabled. That's how he and Sadie meet, and games bring them together. For him, games are good medicine. He can forget about his pain while he's playing.
Yeah, I mean, when I started to write the characters, I thought who games and who benefits from gaming and why do they game, And in the case of Sam and Sadie both, I think gaming is a way to deal with a world in which there is death, and in that Sam, this isn't too much of a spoiler, Sam deals with the loss of his mother early in his life. Sadie's sister has cancer and almost dies, and these things end up being, and I think games are a way for them to kind of escape the fact that we are mortal, But another thing I thought about Sam particularly was that for him, games are a way to be in a body that works perfectly, And so if you think about the opening scene of the book, we have a guy and he's struggling through a train station. We don't really know anything about him yet, but I think for somebody like Sam, video games are easy, but the game that is life is very difficult,
Yes, exactly. That, I lost my train of thought. I was thinking, too, about how very literary everything is, even for Sam. The way he thinks and talks and communicates, even though he's using games. He's also, like Sadie, sort of deeply grounded because it's you, of course, underneath.
I mean, Sam and I share a background. I'm somewhere between Sam and Sadie. I said I was the least like Marx, and that is the truth, but I'm somewhere between Sam and Sadie. I'm half Korean, half Jewish person. I think there's a lot of things in Sam's background that reflect my background. I had this sense, the first time I went to Koreatown in Los Angeles, Sam does this much younger, but I had this sense that had I been raised in Koreatown and not Boca Raton, Florida, which is 66% Jewish, that I would have experienced myself entirely differently, that I would have written different stories and been a different person, and, so a lot of that came from thinking about identity and, and there's a part in the book where Sam talks about wanting to tell stories where like a funny looking mixed race kid could be at the center of the world and not its periphery. And that was something it took me years to discover, that was possible. Like I had never written a book before. I had never conceived of writing a book where somebody like me might be at the center of it, And if anything, it was quite surprising to see how little people seem to have minded that, I thought, I wasn't sure that I would ever necessarily, it seems strange to even say it. I think when I started out, I thought of fiction as a kind of mask I could wear. If I look at my early novels, it seems that I want to make sure that no one could possibly mistake me for anyone in these books. No one could possibly mistake these characters' parents for my parents. These were definitely different people. I wanted this, it was liberating at that point to have this mask, to have this separation where you wouldn't think that was me in any way. But as I wrote more and more books, and as the world changed, actually, I began to think that it would be interesting and even desirable to put myself more at the center of those narratives, to give actually more of myself to those books, and to not be so distanced anymore. And so I started to let that mask slip, and I see over like the last 3 or 4 books that I'm getting closer and closer to this place, and so that's how I arrived at these characters at this time, But yes, his world, for better or for worse, every character you write is limited by the fact that you are their author, I think when I started out as a writer, I didn't know myself very well in a way, and this was a limitation of my earlier novels. I don't think they're all bad books or anything like that. But really, when you write a character, until you've kind of acknowledged yourself, your own prejudices and privileges, it's nearly impossible to write anyone else very well, because everyone you write is either close to you or some distance from you, and you need to understand what that you is before you begin to write anyone else, so.
Oh, that's so profound. I was thinking about, you were really young when your first 2 novels came out. You were still in your 20s.
I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
I thought I was really old.
Yeah.
When I sold my first novel, I think I just turned 25, and they told me it wouldn't come out till I was 27, and I said, but I'll be so old.
Yeah.
Like how will I ever catch up at that pace, Of course, this ended up being ridiculous. It's now been 20 years since my first novel came out, and you guys can do math, so I assume you know how old I am. And I have no problem with being the age that I am. I like being, but I actually forget the age that I am. I just turned 47. But you can do math. You figured that out all on your own, But I was quite young, and I think an interesting thing about that is how much publishing has changed during those years.
Mm-hmm.
Like when my first novel came out, nobody was online. Nobody was, Facebook had not been invented yet, and this is only 20 years ago, and there is no Instagram, obviously. It's the first year of YouTube, I believe, is 2005. And so when I think about that, I feel sad for all of us in one sense, which is that, we're really babies when it comes to the internet, or teenagers at least, because we've only had these things so long. We're now 20-somethings, and so it's maybe makes sense that we haven't quite figured out how we're going to be people online yet. And I think the book is a little bit about that. Sam at one point in the novel talks about how it is not an inevitability that we be the worst versions of ourselves behind the mask of an avatar, and I think we haven't quite figured that out yet, but I think the future of the world relies on the fact that we figure out, and also that tech companies empower us in this, how to be good people behind the masks of an avatar.
Yes, indeed. It's amazing. I mean, I find it infinitely comforting to be in a room with so many people that love a book, that have read a book, that go back to the basics. I mean, for all the techie stuff you describe with the games, it's back to story, it's back to language, it's back to relationships.
Yes, it's a story about human beings, and I think a difficult thing for people is to understand that tech stories are human stories. You know, we want to say this is tech and art isn't there, and you know, nothing is there that relates to me, you know, and we want to put art and culture sitting over there, but they are not separate. They are not going to be separate. We are all merged in those things. And so it wasn't like I had a goal to do this, because I think I've given up, and I don't think of fiction as a vehicle for social change, which is not to say I don't think we are improved by reading books, but just to say that I think that what a novel can do is it can show you a person who is either like you or unlike you, and for a moment make you empathize with somebody who is perhaps unlike you. And this is like the highest goal of a novel. It's not so much that I just don't think that it is useful to, again, have a message in a book that I'm going to teach you these kind of things. But I do think, I didn't set out to do it necessarily, but I am tired of reading stories about tech dystopias. I would like to read stories that talk about the possibility of tech to improve our lives. And it's not like this is that book per se, but I think it is important for our very survival to figure out how we are going to exist in a world where tech is so much of our lives. And so, to me, I knew exactly what the objections to my novel would be before I even wrote it, because I have been writing novels for a long time. I knew that people would be resistant to the topic of gaming and all of these things. But I think it's really important to see that tech is made by humans. Tech has the flaws of humans. And to just figure out how we're going to integrate all these things to make us healthier and more productive human beings, she said.
Yes.
Yeah.
May that be true. Well, I love towards the end. I mean, that your characters make this argument where they say, you know, games help you be empathetic, that you're
Yes.
entering other lives, you're creating lives. It's a community to some extent. And so I'm curious about sort of the next step for this book, which is done so spectacularly well as a book. But there's a film in the works, which I think you're involved with. Is that true?
I mean, I was player 1 on a screenplay, let's put it that way. And they're on player 3 now, I think.
Are they?
So I think it's a really hard book to adapt. You know, I think it would probably make a better limited series, because I think screenplays tend to be very, you know, again, they're things that take place in, you know, 90 to 120 minutes, and they're meant to, again, maybe depict everything through external action. And so much of this book is what, you know, people feel inside themselves,
Yes.
you know, and I feel like it takes more time to develop these kind of complicated things. So I feel like the screenplay has been difficult for us to come to something that's good. And I won't tell them that something is good if I don't think that it is, you know. And so what I am really grateful for, and this is not an optimistic answer about the movie version, I'm grateful that I had this big film sale, because that's important at the beginning of the life of a book. It's one more kind of thing that they can market around. So I'm extremely grateful for that. And then I find that I am so grateful that there has not yet been a movie, because what that means is, for these years, it's now been 2.5 years since the book came out, people have just been allowed to have these characters exist in their minds, and that's where I like them to exist too. You know, I'm excited for a movie for so many reasons. It means more money, it means more copies sold and all of that. I'm not above the, like, you know, commerce, but that said, I love the fact that it hasn't had to compete with these kind of versions of itself yet, you know. It's not that I don't think movies can be better than books. I would love if this movie was better than the book. You know, I love movies, but I don't know that it's a particularly hospitable time for this kind of movie either, you know. I don't know if what people are not going to the theaters that much, and I don't know if what they're looking for are complicated character stories of this kind. You know, movies tend to be all like kissing and fighting and kissing and fighting.
Lots of fighting, right?
You know, and like there's some kissing and plenty of fighting, but I don't know if it plays out in that kind of way. You know, so.
Yes, I have to admit, I was worried that they would reduce it to sort of those moments of action.
I mean, that is what it will
Violence.
be. It's like, and if you think about it, if you think of just practically speaking what a screenplay of this book is like, if you're going to, it just kind of is like almost relentless. People are just arguing and horrible things happen like one after the next without any kind of respite. You know, like I think one of my favorite scenes from the book is the peach farm. And anyway, a cool thing about that scene is that Mr. Masamoto, who runs the peach farm, read the book very early, and he you know, was very moved that his farm had been depicted in this book, and he kind of set up a little tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow thing, you know, where you could go and pick these peaches, and anyway, so it was this strange thing. But yes, if you think about a movie version, where is there time for a peach farm? That's not going to happen. Where is the kissing and the fighting in the scene? How is the plot being furthered, you know? Where is, like, you know, shouldn't something dramatic be happening? And so much of what I crave in, I think, stories are those moments that aren't necessarily just plot, you know, and that kind of thing.
Well, same with me. Well, we could just keep talking and talking.
We could.
I'm going to ask you one more question, but I'm looking at the time. I understand that you can submit questions if you pass them down the rows. I believe there are people that are going to collect them, like Jenny over there, and yes, people over here. So if you've written down questions, pass them along, and we'll keep talking while that's happening.
They're probably feeling quite like, how are we going to get to all of these questions?
I know.
You know?
I see lots of. This makes me think of passing notes in class, but you're
Yes.
allowed to do it. Will you tell us anything about what you're working on, or is that not a good question?
Well, when I started out writing, when I went and did my first interviews for books, I was asked very similar questions, and I told them all about this book about vaudeville that I was writing, and that, you know, it was going to be this wonderful book about vaudeville, and effectually, I realized that when I talked about a book, it made me hate it. And because really, I think the person who promotes the book and the person that writes the book should have very little to do with each other, you know, in the end. Like, I think about it quite often when I'm doing an event like this, that there is a person out here, like she who is the rodeo clown, who comes out and puts on nice shoes and says, and they are nice, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Who puts on dangerous shoes, I should add, you know, who puts on dangerous shoes and is out there making up stories about the work that other person did, you know, and because there's the story you tell about the book, you know, you're J.K. Rowling and you're telling the story about how I came up with all of Harry Potter on the train, you know, on a train ride, and in a flash it all came to me, you know, but we know that isn't really probably a true story, but I think authors are encouraged to make a narrative of that kind, you know. But there's such a conflict, I think, between the person who, again, goes and talks about the book ultimately and the person who writes it, that now I don't tend to talk about work in progress for that reason.
Totally understand. So, what are you reading?
The last thing I read was All Fours. Have you read this?
No, I have not.
You know, I think it is the great American menopause novel. I think it happened, you know. I was very resistant to it the whole time I was reading, and then at a certain point I just gave myself over to it. And I find that sometimes even books that I am resistant to, ultimately, that isn't a bad thing, you know, that you should want to fight a little bit with the text when you're reading it. It shouldn't be too easy on you, you know, but I think it's a fascinating novel, really, really good.
Good recommendation. All right, so I have some questions. Here's one. Actually, it's two. What is your favorite part about the writing process, and what is your least favorite part?
Favorite part about the writing process. Least favorite part about the writing process. I don't know. Some time ago, I said to my agent, I don't think I like anything about being a novelist. And he said to me, this was some years ago, he said to me, I think you should figure out some things to like about it, you know? And of course he was right. I think I was just in a dark place, you know, when you're going out on the road. And my least favorite part is behind me of being a novelist, which is to say I have not had to face an empty room for some time. But that's hard. I've done plenty of events. You know, they say 1 is the loneliest number, but not for book events. So you're thinking, what is the loneliest number? It's 2, because 2 is the loneliest number because you have to entertain 2. 1, you and I are just having a conversation. I can talk to anybody, it's fine. 2, I'm doing an event still, you know? No one can leave. We're all just trapped here. I'm feeling sorry for you because I'm thinking you can't leave either. We're all stuck in this horrible moment. 0 isn't nearly as sad, and I have done some 0s in my career. It's been so 0 is okay because then you just talk to the bookseller and then you go home. You sign some stock. We all pretend this never happened. So that was my least favorite part, which isn't technically the writing process at all. But in terms of the writing process, my least favorite part is probably the beginning because I am something of an introvert who can kind of put out the feeling of an extrovert. And I think the beginning of writing book is like going to a party where you don't know anyone. And so you're sort of just trying to draw out all these people. Please say anything about yourself that's interesting, please. And it's this thing because you don't know the characters well enough to actually write for them well. And so with Tomorrow, I remember thinking, I don't want to do the thing that I see some writers do, which is they spend the first 100 pages getting to know these characters. From page 1, I want to know them, And so it was a different kind of way of approaching the writing. And my favorite thing about writing, and it only happened, so in the book, I talk about that long period of time when your taste and your abilities do not align. And that is something that I felt for like a long time. Which isn't to say I think all of my earlier books are bad or anything like that, but just that is something I experienced. But in the last couple of books, I began to be able to get into more of a place I would describe as a zone. And it's this feeling when you have done all the research you can, when you've gone over a piece of text over and over, and you just know that you can't say something more precisely than you have said it. So for me, like the 2 sections in the book that were the things I went over the most were probably the NPC section and also pioneers. And so because I knew that because they are experimental in some way, they're experimental formally, that they would need to really work or they wouldn't work at all. And so there's a pleasure for that in me when I've kind of when I finally unlocked how I'm going to tell this story, and I found a unique or interesting way to do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, it's complicated. It's amazingly complicated.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
It's complicated. Yeah.
Right. I think this is a simple question.
Okay.
It's a shift.
And that one had 2 parts, so
I did have 2 parts. This is just one. It's very short.
Usually I have forgotten the second part by the time somebody.
I don't like to do that.
Yeah.
No, I understand. So this is just, what is your favorite game?
What is my favorite game?
Maybe it's a hard question.
It is a hard question, So the first game I can remember playing that, which really the first game I ever played, was a game called Alley Cat. And I think about Alley Cat almost every day. Alley Cat was a game that came preloaded on a work computer my dad brought home. And, you play, this is going to surprise you, you play a cat. And the cat lives behind this kind of like apartment building, and he jumps up on these garbage cans to access these different windows that represent the apartments. And behind each window is a mini game, and thus an entire world. And so I think about Alley Cat all the time whenever I'm walking by an apartment building. I think about the fact that behind every window, there is a whole world, a whole novel, a whole life that I'll probably never know, So I think about it all the time.
I love that. Here's an interesting question. We talked about a potential movie. What about a potential video game based on your book?
I love that question. I've been asked that maybe once before, and I do think it would be a fascinating video game, and maybe what I would love more than anything is if it became like a hugely successful movie that I hate but everyone else loves, and then it became a video game, would be a wonderful ending for that. Because I think, sometimes I get into these discussions with people about like, are video games art? And of course they are art. They involve all these kinds of things that are indisputably art. The idea that we can try to, again, bend to communicate some real, I got a honk there, so I don't know if it's
something.
But of course they are art, and I think, again, the person who is like, but haha, the Great Wave is much, much better than Angry Birds. Well, I'm not, like, they're not comparable. All games are not Angry Birds, and, all, ukiyo-e are not, the Great Wave. There's all kinds of things that people make. And so I think everything that video games have been is not everything they will be. And there's like huge potential in that form because it is a form that is uniquely empathetic. You know, it's even more empathetic than what novelists do, because anybody can read a novel, and you can't really lose when you read a novel. You've done it, you know, but you can lose a game, you know, in that sense. And so I think it would be fascinating to kind of approach again, something very complicated and literary in a video game form, you know. I don't think that, as much as I like The Last of Us, I don't think that's going to be the end of what people use the form to do.
Interesting.
But that is, you know, The Last of Us is a brilliant game. It's a game I always cite because it does something that I can't do as a novelist. So you guys all know it from the show, or you know the game, but you know, you're in. They're not zombies, they're the infected, so I don't want to get that right, but you spend the first 2 hours of the game killing various people, the infected, and then, so you've done the bad things, you've been the character that does the bad things, and then it turns into a meditation on the value of a single human life, you know, and so it's this kind of uniquely empathetic experience that only a video game can give you, and so I want more of that in my games, you know.
Well, we hope you have influence.
I have no influence, yeah.
Oh, I don't know about that. Well, let's end with a question that I probably should have asked at the beginning that someone's asking here. I'm just curious about like early books that entranced you as a girl.
As a girl.
As a young person. A little person.
Well, I did a podcast about this subject, and it was kind of about a children's book, and then you went back and read it again. So a book I read when I was really young was A Little Princess, you know, and there were very few kind of heroines like Sarah Crew, you know, in that way, these kind of like aggressively intellectual little girls, you know, that have and you know, really what that book is about, and is about the ability of this young person to use her imagination to conceive of herself out of a bad situation, you know, and so it is about the power of imagination. And so that was a book that I loved when I was a kid, ignored the weird racism and other things that you will find in almost every children's book you go back to, you know. But yes, I feel like the first kind of, I had a wonderful English teacher when I was about 16, and for AP English, and she had great taste. And so it was really the first kind of contemporary literary fiction I read, and on that reading list was Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon and Rolf Ellison's Invisible Man. And I remember reading both of those books and thinking, this is the kind of writing I want to do, you know, like that. There were so many interesting literary tricks in Song of Solomon that I was eager to take those on myself, you know. And so I think sometimes there can be something about reading a book that is really ambitious in its technique that makes you think this is something I want to play with, you know. And so those were some books that were really influential to me. In thinking about Tomorrow, I found myself thinking about, you know, The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay quite a lot, you know. Yeah. And wondering why there hadn't been a book that was about video games in the way Cavalier and Clay is about comic books, you know, because I wanted to see this book, you know. And then I realized there hadn't been that book because, you know, people in my field didn't think this was a subject that was worthy of that kind of exploration yet, you know. And so I felt like scared and excited to try to write such a book myself, you know. But Cavalier and Clay is a book that was really influential to me as well.
That's a great comparison. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Such a great conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Available on demand on the CPL YouTube page. They can watch it. If you are interested